today for our webinar. We're really excited to have you here. My name's Sarah Woodbury. I'm the communications coordinator at Wild Utah Project. And we just want to say we're especially excited to have you and to have these amazing presenters here during COVID-19. We know it's a hard time, and we're just grateful to be with you virtually. And before we begin, I just have one important note to share. So as we are presenting in Salt Lake City, we just want to acknowledge that we work and live on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Shoshone, Goshute, and Ute peoples. And then I'll share a few housekeeping items and a brief overview, and then I will introduce our first speaker and we will get started. So first off, please just note that you are each muted, so we can't hear you, no one can hear you, and also you can't share your screen, so no one can see what you're doing either. Only hosts and panelists are able to share their screens. And then also, as you think of questions, we have a little Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So if you move your mouse, you should be able to see that, and you just can click that and type in your questions as you think of them. And we will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar with our amazing presenters. And then also, if you have comments you would like to share, you can type those into the chat box also at the bottom of the screen. And if we have any links or other resources to share, that's where those will be as well. So keep an eye out for that. If captions would be helpful for your experience, please just let us know afterward, and we will send you a recording of this webinar with a transcript. And also on that note, we will be recording this, so you will be able to have access to it afterward and share it with people. So just know that. And then briefly, our schedule will start with Amy Sibul, who will look at the large-scale world of pollinators. And then we'll move to Mindy Wheeler, who will focus in on the milkweed world and give a little bit more detail on pollination. And then Mary Pendergast will talk a little bit about how we can get involved locally and what Utah Pollinator Pursuit is. And then we will have a Q&A session. So Amy Sibul will be our first speaker, and I am grateful to introduce her, grateful that she's with us. So she is a conservation biologist and faculty member at the University of Utah in the School of Biological Sciences. And she has a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology from Colorado State, and she has a Master's of Science in Plant Ecology from Utah State. She previously was a threatened and endangered species specialist for an environmental consulting firm and the director of conservation at Red Butte Garden. Amy currently works as a conservation biologist at the University of Utah, where she's been since 2011. She teaches conservation biology and is passionate about bee and pollinator conservation and awareness. Thank you so much for being here, Amy.
Really happy to be here. I love talking about pollinators. I'm happy to do so with you today. I'm going to quickly share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully that's working. Sarah, is that up?
Yes, that is perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So in addition to being a conservation biologist, I also happen to be the community engaged learning coordinator for the School of Biology. And I love this idea of community science. I'm really happy to be part of the conversation today, and the Utah Pollinator Pursuit is going to be an amazing opportunity to engage with your community of pollinators, as well as those who are interested in the human world. Today I want to give you this kind of 30,000-foot view of pollinators. We hear in the media that pollinators are important, that bees are important, that 1 out of every 3 bites we take of food is thanks to a pollinator. But let's back up a little bit and kind of talk about what that really means and what we're talking about when we talk about pollinators. So we know that there are a huge number of flowering plants on the earth. Over 350,000 different species of flowering plants. And that includes grasses and maple trees and all kinds of the beautiful perennials that we keep in our gardens, whether in your yard or in our open spaces and parks. Between 3/4 and 90%, depending on where you are on the globe, of those flowering plant species actually need an animal vector to carry pollen from flower to flower in order to set seed. The rest of those plants are wind pollinated. And Mindy, the next speaker, is going to talk to you a little bit more about the biology and the anatomy of pollination. But just for now, know that the vast majority of flowering plants on Earth need an animal to carry pollen from flower to flower in order to set seed to recruit new individuals to that population of plants for the next season. There are about 200,000 different species of animals on the earth that act as pollinators. About 1,000 of them are birds, bats, and other small mammals, but the vast majority, 199,000 of those 200,000 species, are insects. So when we're talking about pollinators, we are primarily talking about insects. That includes bees, beetles, some ants, a few wasps, butterflies, and moths. But of all of those different kinds of insects, bees pollinate the largest number of plant species. Of those, on average, 87% of the flowering plants on Earth needing an animal to carry pollen, it's 80% are bees that do that pollination carry. 7% are those other birds, bats, and small mammals. So bees are the world's most important, most efficient pollinators. When we're talking about pollinators too, there's a huge diversity of bees on the face of the earth. Globally, there are 20,000 different species of bees. That's almost twice the number of bird species that we find globally. In North America, there are about 4,000 species of bees. And in Utah alone, we have over 1,100 scientifically cataloged species of bees. So to contrast, we have about 450 species of birds that you can see in Utah. We have more than double the number of bees that you find in Utah. They are incredibly diverse, and we know so little about them. Most people hardly even know anything about bees other than the existence of honeybees and maybe bumblebees. But they are the most ecologically important group of pollinators. They're diverse, and they're right under our noses everywhere we look, whether we're in urban spaces or in our natural lands of Utah. What makes bees so important when it comes to pollination is that they are the only group of animals that co-evolved with flowering plants to deliberately collect pollen and carry it. They're not carrying it for the purpose of plant pollination. They're carrying it in order to bring it back to their little nests to feed to their offspring. But it happens to be incredibly beneficial to the flowering plants as it is to those little bee babies that are feeding on the pollen. Bees exhibit what we call high flower constantly. They repeatedly visit one particular plant species more than any other pollinator we know of. So they'll visit aster after aster after aster of the same species, carrying pollen from one flower to the next. And on any given foraging trip, a female bee could visit hundreds of flowers, again, often within that same species, transferring pollen all along the way, allowing the plant to set seed for the new generation. And when I say female bees, I mean it. It is actually only the female bees that are gathering the pollen to bring back to the nest to provision the young. If you look at these photos in the bottom of my PowerPoint slide here, there's a nice visual representation of what I mean when I say that bees are the most efficient at carrying pollen. That picture of the bee on the right, you can see the underside of its abdomen, the legs, even the head and antennae show huge piles of pollen coating these specially evolved branched hairs that evolved to carry pollen. She is completely loaded up with that yellow, dusty pollen substance. If you look at the monarch butterfly, which is the central picture, yes, you can see those little white pollen grains. I believe it's pollinating yarrow there, potentially. You can see a few white pollen grains on the proboscis. That monarch is definitely going to carry that pollen from one flower to the next, but you can see there's an awful lot less pollen on there. But she is an effective and important pollinator as well. And then the beetle on the left, you can see that beetle has pollen on it as well, but beetles tend to sit in flowers and munch on pollen. They're not deliberately, nor is the butterfly, carrying pollen from one flower to the next. And they don't have these specialized anatomical features that allow for large volumes of pollen to be carried. So when we're talking about important pollinators, for the most part, we're talking about bees. You've probably heard that there are declines among pollinators, and yes, that includes all of our groups of pollinators, whether it's bees, butterflies, or any of the other animal vectors for pollen. The single most important contribution to these declines is habitat loss, and that includes deterioration of habitat, fragmentation, and outright human development of habitat. And we can talk about the plants that serve as host species, whether for animals that are laying eggs on them, or for the leaf matter that animals are eating or using, like this leafcutter bee actually on the right, which is harvesting some leaf material to take back to plug up its little nest, or the floral resources that provide nectar and pollen for our pollinators. All of that loss of those species is in the category of habitat loss. That habitat loss, disruption, and fragmentation also contributes to the disruption of migratory routes, particularly with species like hummingbirds, nectar-feeding bats that are migratory, and a few butterfly species, including monarchs, which of course will be a focus later on in today's presentation. Global climate change is also contributing to the decline in pollinators. One of the biggest problems with global climate change is it messes up what's called the phenology, or the timing of when flowers are blooming and when pollinators are emerging, hatching from their eggs, and becoming active at visiting flowers. So if a flower blooms a little earlier because of warmer temperatures, but there isn't a corresponding earlier hatching of our pollinators, they're not going to be able to find those floral resources that need them to sustain the population. So that's contributing to decline as well. We know of a few incidences of introduced parasites that are carried by imported bees that are getting out into our wild populations. We also know that there can be competition from exotic pollinators to our natural populations that can lead to a decline. But really the problem is habitat loss. And so when we talk about wanting to help combat pollinator decline, we're talking about creating habitats where these pollinators can breed, lay their eggs, nest, or creating habitat and plant resources where they can feed off of them. So that's a little overview of, what kind of pollinator diversity we see out there, who does the heavy lifting of pollination, which is bees, of course. I want to give you an idea now, a little bit deeper into the diversity of bees, especially in Utah. It's kind of mind-blowing once you learn how many different species of bees and how beautiful diversity there is with bees, that you can go out and start seeing them everywhere. All you need is a little bit of information. So if you're looking at this picture here, you can see what I think will be a familiar species to you. This is the bee that everyone identifies with that term bee. It's a honeybee, Apis mellifera. There are between 7 and 11 species of honeybees in the world, depending on who you talk to. Geneticists are splitting them or lumping them. But that's a very, very small slice of the 20,000 different species of bees we see globally. And they're actually very unique. They're not representative of the way bees behave and nest, even though they're beautiful. And I love the idea of beekeeping and adore honey. But let's talk a little bit more about some of these other bees as well. If you're looking at these photos, you can see things that look kind of like bees, but in fact are not. The two outer photos, the top right and the bottom left, are actually flies. And I'm going to go through the anatomical characteristics you can look at very quickly and tell if you're seeing a fly, a wasp, or a bee. The other two photos there in the middle and the top left are wasps. You can see a paper wasp there. And then if you're looking at that bottom picture, a lot of folks I meet out on hikes and in the foothills think that that might be a kind of a feral honeybee colony. In fact, that's the home of our only native hornet. It's called a bald-faced hornet. It's actually a black and white hornet. Doesn't have any yellow on it at all. And they make these amazing, intricate, kind of papery structures that houses their colonies. But none of these are bees on this picture, even though they kind of look like them. In contrast, all 5 of these pictures are bees that you find in Utah. Carpenter bees, orchard bees, mining bees, squash bees, sunflower bees. We have an incredible array of beautiful bees, all different colors with fairly different habitats as far as where they nest and what flowers they visit. So they're not going to look like your typical black and yellow bee. They're going to look all rainbow of colors, sizes, and flower visitations. I can give you an idea of what almost all bee species have in common, so that when you're out in the gardens and in the wild spaces, you can quickly look at an insect and determine whether that's a bee or not. And that's going to kind of open up this whole new world of understanding of the organisms we share our neighborhoods with. The bottom right picture is a bee. You've seen that in the previous slide. The middle picture is a fly, and the far left picture is a wasp. What bees all have in common, first and foremost, is these fuzzy branched hairs that coat their body. Heads, thorax, abdomen, legs are coated with these branched fuzzy hairs that, again, these structures co-evolved to carry pollen purposely back to their little bee nests. If you see a non-fuzzy insect, it is not a bee, with very few exceptions. Some flies are a little bit fuzzy, especially the flower visiting flies, and they're mimicking bees, but almost invariably a fuzzy insect is a bee. If you see a fuzzy insect and its wings are laid parallel when they're at rest, they kind of cover each other and form a straight line, that's a bee characteristic as well. You can look at that center photo and see that the wings are not laying parallel at rest, they're forming more of an A-frame picture there, and so they're not going to be a fly, or excuse me, they're not going to be a bee. You can also look at the obvious antenna of a bee. You can always see the antenna on a bee. You generally see either very short, stubby, or almost non-existent antennas on flies. If you look at the wasp on the far left, you'll see that yes, the antennae are visible, but if you look at the wings, you can see that they're more linear and they're not folding over the back of the insect, combined with the fact that that wasp has very smooth, shiny exoskeleton. It doesn't have any fuzzy hairs. That helps you understand wasp, not bee. Another main physical characteristic that allows you to identify a bee from other insects is by looking at their eyes. They have smaller oval-shaped eyes on the sides of their head. Contrast that with the fly in the center picture. Flies have these giant eyes that take up almost their entire head, almost nothing but eye on that fly head. And then if you look at the wasp, they have kind of round, small, beady, evil-looking eyes to convey that they're a wasp and not a bee. If you get a really close-up look at a bee, you can see they have these three little polka dot eyes, glossy little eyes on the top of their head called ocelli that helps them gather light into those structures. But mostly you'll see those main comma or oval-shaped eyes on the sides of their head. And then finally, if you see an insect flying around that is coated with pollen, it is more than likely a bee. Female bees, again, are the ones that are deliberately carrying pollen from flower back to their nests, and they're the ones carrying it on their legs and their abdomens and underneath their thorax as well. So those are the 5 main characteristics you look at to say, oh, that's a bee, or no, that's not a bee. And I like to talk about this in part because so many people who I talk to that say they've been stung by a bee, or that the bees were really bothering them during their picnic, I have to point out, well, next time take a closer look. It probably wasn't a bee. If you were trying to eat, you know, barbecue chicken at a picnic in a park and something came and tried to harvest that chicken from your plate, it was a wasp, because bees are vegetarians. They only eat pollen and nectar. All right, so kind of digging down to the next layer of understanding more about bees. Most people understand about honeybees. They live in these large, complex, socially stratified colonies that we call hives, where you have a queen, you have thousands of workers, and they're maintaining that hive over the course of the season. The vast majority of bees are not honeybees. They are solitary, either ground nesting or cavity nesting bees that consist of a female laying eggs, and that's about it. And let's go into the life cycle a little bit, contrasting these different bees. So I've parsed out 3 different categories: honeybee life cycle, solitary bee life cycle, and then a bumblebee life cycle, and they're all a little bit different. Again, the honeybees, I think most people understand there's a queen. She can lay upwards of 1,500 eggs per day in a hive. And then she has tens of thousands of workers. A healthy honeybee hive will have 40, 50, 60,000 workers tending to the developing larvae, cleaning the hive, guarding the hive, and going out foraging for the pollen and nectar. And then you have the male drones. There are only a few of them in each hive. Their job is to tend to the queen. The hive will persist throughout the flowering season, but also through the winter. They'll actually overwinter with the queen and a couple tens of thousands of bees, maintaining the warmth of the hive, eating their honey stores, etc. So they live year after year if all goes well. That contrasts with the solitary bees, which is again the vast majority of bees in the world, where you have a female that emerges from a little cavity in the spring. She quickly mates with a few males, lays a few eggs, each of which she provisions with that pollen that she's collecting, as well as the nectar from the flower sources. She'll mix the pollen and nectar and create a little, what's called like bread, pollen bread, basically, for the eggs that you can see that she's laid on that pollen bread, and then the larvae develops over the course of the next 10 months or so. So most of the time, our solitary bees exist in their little cavities as eggs, larvae, or pupa. The reason we see a whole variety of different bees from March all the way through October is that different species of solitary bees are emerging at different times from those little nests. So our orchard bees are emerging in late March and early April, whereas our sunflower bees aren't emerging until maybe July or August, and the same goes for all the other different species. Bumblebees are just a little bit different. They have a 1-year life cycle for the queen only, actually. The queen will be the one part of the bumblebee kind of semi-social group that will actually hibernate through the winter. She'll emerge hungry in the spring from a little cubby where she's been hibernating in an old rodent's nest, or maybe in a nice dense bunch grass that's protected, or even under a nice pile of leaves, which is why we should leave our leaves in the fall to some degree. She'll emerge, eat, and then she'll go about creating her own small nest of somewhere from a few dozen to maybe at the most 200 or so workers that'll persist through the spring and summer. In the fall, all of those workers die. There are a few queens that have been reared, maybe 4 or 5 per nest. They're going to go out in the fall and mate, and then go ahead and find that place to hibernate for the winter. So just a little bit different, simpler lifestyle from the honeybee, a little more complex than the solitary bee. I'm really lucky to actually have a bumblebee nest in my backyard this summer. I'm very excited about that, so I can watch this life cycle. I want to give you a little taste of the diversity of bees. This is going to be a very small taste because there are more bees than I have time to talk about, but a large diversity of bees that we find in Utah are called mining bees. Again, solitary, they nest in the ground, they're tiny, not very obvious, and what you're most likely to see are the little holes that you see they dig in bare soil in order to lay their eggs. If you see these little holes in soil, maybe in a park or in your yard, count yourself as lucky, because these are those cute little mining bees that are taking up residence in these open spots. A nice big family of bees is called the Megachilidae. They're mason and leafcutter bees. You may have heard of mason bees. Costco is even selling mason bee nest boxes, among other vendors. There's a picture of some holes drilled in wood with a couple of the mason bees. That's actually on my front porch. I love keeping mason bees. But there are a wide variety of them. They are all cavity nesters, so they're going to look for cavities in holes, hollow tubes of grasses, maybe cavities left by ground boring beetles in trees. That's where they're going to lay their eggs, and they're going to provision their nests similarly by bringing pollen, again, from flower to flower back to their nests. They have this cute habit of carrying their pollen on the undersides of their belly. So if you see a bee with pollen under its belly, it's going to be in this family of bees. And I can give you just a quick update on how to create a nest box of your own, so you don't have to buy it from someone if you want later. And then the last family I want to highlight, it's not the last in the world of bees, but it's the last one I'll talk about today, and that's the longhorn and carpenter bees. This is the largest, most diverse family that we find. This is the family that honeybees dwell in. Carpenter bees are a bee you might see in this family because they're just enormous. They're very noticeable on the landscape. They can be even larger than a bumblebee, and some are this glossy purpley black that you see here in the lower left corner. Others have that glossy purpley abdomen, but they have a fuzzy thorax where the wings emerge. They're not afraid of humans, but they're also completely harmless to us, and they do nest in wooden cavities that they can excavate. My favorite, personal favorite bee are the longhorn bees, also in this family. They have this adorable habit of the males sleeping in sunflowers in late summer. So look to your sunflowers in August and look for these male longhorn bees. They aren't sleeping in the little nest. They are instead sleeping in flowers. And this is just a video I took in my front yard last year of these longhorn bees in the sunflowers. Bumblebees are generally a beloved group of bees. We have about 30 species or so here in the Western United States, and there are multiple resources to help you identify them. There are also multiple community science projects that you can be involved with when it comes to bumblebees and helping us understand where they live, where we can find them, and tracking their abundance across the United States. I've included some websites here. I believe I can make this PowerPoint available to the attendees here, so I'll make sure Sarah has this information and she can share it with you so you can click on these websites and go to these guides. One thing I want to note is that it's all about the coloration when you're trying to identify the different species of bumblebees. So you'll look at the bands of color that they have, both on their head, thorax, and their abdomen. And there are these great kind of easy resources to help you understand what you're looking at. I personally love this bumblebeewatch.org website and the phone app that you can download. You can upload photos of bumblebees. It adds them to their database, but also allows you to identify them. But again, Utah Pollinator Pursuit, which we're all here to talk about today, will also be an excellent resource. You can actually, I was going to mention this big left picture is actually a poster that you can get a PDF of from the from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So check that out, that website. All right, if you are hoping to create habitat components, and again, habitat loss is the single largest contributor to pollinator decline. There are some very easy things you can incorporate in your yard if you're lucky enough to have one, or in your open spaces near where you live, whether that's a park or the foothills, wherever. The easiest thing you can possibly do is simply leave a few spots of bare soil in your gardens and open spaces. This will allow the ground nesting bees space to lay their eggs and to have a little nest. I promise you they are gentle, docile, they do not care about humans. I have them all over my yard. I see them all over the wild spaces, and they just are not aggressive at all, and you're so unlikely to get stung by them. So leaving a few spots of bare soil poses no risk and is all benefits. About 75% of the world's bees are actually ground nesting, so this is number one. Another thing you can do is plant, of course, these native flowering plants that bloom from March to November. Any of the plants that you found here in these lands before we started importing our horticultural plants is going to be beautifully suited for the bees that you find here naturally as well. You want the bloom times to vary just as much as the emergence of bees vary. So from March to November, as many of different flowers as you can in your yards and open spaces. Native bunch grasses are also an excellent component, in part because it provides early pollen for these emerging bees, and also because bumblebee queens like to overwinter in the center of those bunch grasses. So great hibernation habitat for bumblebees. And then again, like I mentioned, you can create a nest box and you can drill holes in wood. You can also collect hollow stems. There are all kinds of reed grasses, including Phragmites, which is an invasive species. You can remove that from our wetlands, cut about 6-inch length stems and put them in a little house, and the cavity nesting bees will find that. This website here, www.xerces.org, has an incredible array of information sheets that you can download and look to get the dimensions and the proper construction directions for those. And then finally, just including some rock piles or walls in your landscaping along with your bare soil that creates these little cavities that our cavity nesting bees like to use for their breeding habitat. So floral resources for pollinators, breeding resources for pollinators. Those are the two components you want to think about most. For the last couple of slides, I just want to shout out to the other pollinators that are important in our Utah landscapes. One of them is our hummingbirds. We have 4 species that you can see in Utah. 2 of them nest here. That's the black-chinned hummingbird on the far left. You can see it's not black at all, but rather beautiful iridescent purple. And then the broad-tailed hummingbird. Those are the 2 center photos, pollinating our beautiful Utah penstemon as well as a sunflower. Two other species that travel through and migrate through are the calliope hummingbird in the top right, and then the rufous hummingbird. And as you can see, the rufous hummingbird is actually sipping nectar from a milkweed. So milkweeds are not only going to be incredibly important for monarchs to lay their eggs on, but they're also a fantastic nectar source for a wide array of other pollinators. To attract Utah's hummingbirds, they tend to like orange and pink and red tubular flowers. They arrive from their migratory overwintering grounds in Central and South America in April, and they usually are migrating back south by late September, early October. Something that people don't often know is that hummingbirds also eat insects. The females especially will collect insects to feed their nestlings. So avoiding insecticides is not only great for our insect pollinators, but is great for our insect-eating hummingbirds as well. And then the final shout out to Utah's butterflies. I know we want to talk about monarchs, and so I just wanted to introduce and kind of segue with this. There are about 200 species found in our state. We have a robust Utah Lepidopterist Society, and their website is worth checking out and can help you identify your butterflies. The two I've shown here are the black swallowtail on the right and the two-tailed swallowtail on the left, two of my favorites to spot. And I don't know if you noticed this, but the black swallowtail is again feeding on milkweeds, so an important plant to incorporate into our open spaces. As you probably know, monarchs are in trouble. Absolutely one of the pollinators that is in decline, and particularly our western population, which has seen massive and troubling decline, 99% decline since the 1980s. Again, loss of habitat, both breeding habitat in the milkweeds as well as nectar sources in the floral plantings. And there are so many things we can do to combat the loss of this habitat in our own spaces. One of the organizations you can connect with is the Monarch Milkweed Mapper at this website below to learn more and to be part of a national effort for community-based research. So what can you do? Well, yes, plant milkweeds, but also other butterfly-friendly perennials. You can limit, if you're worried about the eastern population of monarchs, especially limit your avocado consumption from the Michoacan area, which is where our eastern population of monarchs overwinters in the pine forest there. But also, just as important as planting plants, you can be part of the community science effort and the Utah Pollinator Pursuit. With that, I'm going to hand this over to Mindy, who's going to talk more about pollination and these other issues. So thanks so much. I'll take questions at the end, so make sure to put those in the chat if you have any.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was wonderful. Wow, yeah, lots of information there. Once again, put any questions you have in the chat box or in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go over those at the end of the presentation. So our next speaker will be Mindy Wheeler. Mindy is the Rare Plant Conservation Coordinator for the state of Utah and Utah State University Wildland Resources. She helped develop Utah Pollinator Pursuit project, which works to answer questions about monarchs and bumblebees and the plants they depend on across Utah in an effort to conserve them. She's done extensive work with native pollen plants and pollinators and has a wealth of information on details and connections in the pollinator world, and we're excited to hear from her. Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you everybody for joining us here. Really appreciate it. And now I'm struggling a little bit. Oh, I gotta find there it is. Okay, so I know that the name of the webinar was the beautiful intricacies of pollination or something, but once I started getting into this, I don't know, was in a mood for levity, and so I just grabbed a whole bunch of cartoons that sort of got the point across, and hopefully you'll enjoy it while learning something from some of these pretty simple cartoons here. And I'm just going to pause a little minute here and make sure that everybody reads this one. I got such a kick out of it because there is a lot going on in your backyard and the open spaces, and a lot of it involves reproduction. So on that note, so essentially what it comes down to is flowers do what most organisms do, right? They make themselves attractive for the right partners to successfully reproduce. Does that sound kind of familiar? So again, a couple of these pretty simple yet poignant, I guess, and get the point across cartoons gets that across. I love these very innocent looking bees here. And then also I just wanted to make a point that yes, some plants can reproduce asexually, right? So I'm not going to cover that today, but I just wanted to make that clear that, you know, it's from rhizomes, tubers, plant pieces. Some plants are very good at reproducing asexually. So, and again, I just got a big old kick out of the ePollinate site there. So just the simplest view possible of pollination. And again, I just love this bee, you know, with his hands picking a piece of pollen up from this plant and just throwing it into the stigma, female parts of this flower, and voila, you have seeds. Of course, there is a little bit more to it than that, but again, I had to share this, and I love the bee feet, especially on that one. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly review the flower parts. Just again, most of you are probably familiar with this, but you have the male parts of the anther, which produces the pollen here, the filament that holds the anther, that's collectively known as the stamen, the female parts of the stigma and the style, and the ovary down at the bottom. Again, kind of a simplistic view of flowers, but important to sort of understand. Here's a little bit better resolution of how pollination occurs. Here's a schematic of a pollen grain here, produced from the anther, hits the stigma, travels down these pollen tubes, gets fertilized down here in the ovary and the ovules, and produces seeds. So the other interesting thing too is just to get an idea of scale of this. So pollen grains range from about 15 to 200 microns. And again, for comparison, a human hair is about 75 microns. So we're talking pretty tiny here. And what I find interesting is that there are scientists out there that make their living out of studying pollen. So they can do cores from the earth and figure out how old that earth is, way down maybe 30 feet. And then they can reconstruct the vegetation community by the types of pollen grains that are in that soil. Really fascinating stuff. So it is definitely a beautiful partnership in terms of, you know, the flowers receive the transfer of pollen for creating future generations, and that's of course getting the genetic diversity and making sure that the next generation survives and persists. And then the insects and hummingbirds and other pollinators they get the pollen and nectar to feed themselves and their young, just like Amy mentioned here. And again, this hummingbird is asking for nectar on the rocks in his weight. Apparently, they can drink up to 14 times their body weight in a day to keep themselves fueled up. Kind of amazing, I think. My mouse keeps disappearing. So types of pollination, and sorry to those of you who might be allergic to pine pollen, maybe you're sneezing already. They are wind pollinated, just as most grasses are. So they just produce a boatload of pollen and it sheds it with the wind in hopes that that pollen lands on the correct plant and fertilizes and makes more plants for the new generation. But then, of course, you also have insect pollen, which can become a lot more specific. So specific species can concentrate on plant families. They can concentrate on genus, which is even more specific, sometimes even species. And a great example of that, of course, is the fig and the fig wasp. And if you guys don't know that story, it is a wonderful story to poke into and get familiar with. It's a pretty amazing example of co-evolution over the millennia. So Again, it's to lure the right partner and or pollinator, flowers have sort of evolved over the millennia to attract the most efficient pollinators, right? So we have all these different colors and we have all these different shapes that can cater to or are specific to pollinators, or have found this particular shape is great for where they live and what pollinators are there. It's again pretty amazing. And then of course there's also the flowers that, as we all know, some flowers have a wonderful scent, which is also part of the attracting the right pollinator as well, right? So I just grabbed this example here. It's a plant in South Africa that mimics the smell of a distressed and or dead bee, right? So here comes the fly whose job it is to do the decomposition and clean up after some things die in the forest, right? Well, they land on this flower, and in the meantime, they pick up pollen from this flower. They're not finding the distressed or dead bee, so they fly off to the next flower that smells the same, and they have become not necessarily an unwilling, but an unknowing pollinator. So it's an incredible example of chemical mimicry, which there are a number of others like that as well. Pretty incredible and intelligent world out there. So something to recognize also is that pollination is not always successful, right? So you see that pine pollen coming off the pine tree, and it is going to land in a lot of places other than other pine trees. And it's not going to make a hybrid between a pine tree and a sunflower seed. Anyway, not going to make a hybrid between those two, right? So there is a lot of chemistry and biochemistry going on as well, that each species of flower is able to recognize the pollen that is acceptable to it. Sorry, I got a kick out of this one too. So just to show you sort of I put this slide up just to show how detailed it can get in terms of the pollen is recognized by the stigma on an incompatible plant. There's a protein that interacts with the receptor, and it's this chemical that initiates this recognition and rejection, right? So there is a lot of details to be worked out and studied in terms of how that chemical and biochemical reactions work and or don't work to either accept or reject the pollen that might land on the flower. Just a little bit more. So there's all sorts of plant morphology strategies in terms of how best to get pollinated and to make those generations survive and persist. So some plants, the male and female blossoms are on totally different plants. They are called dioecious, meaning in Latin, that's literally two houses. So one house has the male plants, one house has the female plants, and these are a few examples of those. Then there's, of course, the monoecious plants, are literally one house plants, that each plant has both male and female flowers on it. And then, of course, there are some plants that have male and female plants on the same blooms as well. So again, whatever works in terms of their persistence and ability to get pollinated and fertilized, they're going to go with it. And so many of these have, of course, evolved over the millennia to persist. So again, strategies. Some plants require cross-pollination, meaning that a pollen grain taken from one plant, it has to go to an entirely different individual. It has to go into an entirely different plant in order for it to get fertilized and reproduce. However, of course, there are those that can self-pollinate, meaning the anther from one flower can shed its pollen into the stigma of the same flower and get fertilized. And what I find interesting too is that a lot of plants can do both. And sort of it takes a lot of looking into in terms of what proportion is cross-pollinated and what proportion is self-pollinated, and sort of the fitness, the offspring fitness of each is, you know, a whole nother mode of study that people have gotten into, maybe in my next life. So what I really wanted to get into, I thought maybe that would be some good background for talking about milkweeds in general. Milkweeds, as Amy shared, is the only plant that monarchs can lay their eggs on, because that's what the larvae eat when they hatch. But it does provide abundant nectar for many other pollinators. The flower structure is very highly evolved, and we'll get into that in a minute. And like I said, it's the only plant that the monarchs can lay their eggs on. So just quickly, distinguishing characteristics, of course, it's called milkweed for a reason, right? If you tear a leaf a little bit, you'll see it exude this milky latex here, milky sap. So there are a few other plants that do that, but the combination of this and this flowering head that sort of looks like a globe of flowers, all originating from one spot, that's another sort of distinguishing characteristic of milkweed. And then, of course, there is the really distinctive flower structure, sort of way beyond that very simple flower structure that I showed you earlier. These down here are the petals. This is sort of the for lack of better words, the worker bee, I guess, of the milkweeds in terms of its structure. So, and these, you can kind of see, these are the different species of milkweed, and they all have these, they're called hoods and horns, stigmatic slits. Anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. So the next slide shows this flower from a top view. And this is anyway, very interesting in terms of, so these here, I think you can see my pointer, are the petals that have not reflexed yet. This is sort of it's the reproductive part of the flower. It's the stigmatic disc, it's called. Over here are the anthers, but a very interesting part of the milkweeds are these hoods and horns. So at the base of these horns, in insect terms apparently, is just pools of nectar. They produce a lot of nectar, like that bee, or I can't remember what was going after it in Amy's photo. So, but the other interesting thing is that these hoods and horns are very waxy and slippery, and that really influences how the pollinator behaves, right? So this pollinator is getting very desperate for this lovely nectar at the bottom, and he or she is putting its feet and, you know, nose and everything all over the place in this milkweed, which is exactly what the milkweed wants and needs, right? So here's that same stigmatic disc, and within these anthers, this is the pollen, and the pollen is in these sort of sacs called pollinia, right? So they are together, they're hooked together by this corpusculum, I'm going to call it a clamp, that gets pulled out of the stigmatic disc up there when the pollinators come by. One thing to note here, and we'll come back to this, is the translator arms here. See the lovely 90-degree angle that they have here, and that changes with pollination, and I will get to that in a second. And so here, I hope this works. Okay, so this hopefully will show, and I think it went, sometimes my internet. So that's the stigmatic disc. Imagine this is an insect arm. And there's the pollinia that gets pulled out by that, just that touching of that stigmatic disc, it comes out. So as you might imagine, you can't really hand pollinate milkweed. So sorry for the walls of text here. What I wanted to get at here, essentially, you can kind of see this bee. I think it's a bee. Hopefully, Amy agrees with me. Anyway, is see how its legs are kind of all over the place. He's trying to balance himself and try to get at that beautiful nectar. Well, as he's doing that, he's got all these pollinia sacs attached to his legs here, right? Probably her legs. So what's interesting here too is that that stigmatic slit is lined with bristles. That the only way that insect leg can go after it's in there is up. And so as the pollinator pulls its leg up, it will pull the pollinia with it. So we're back to this, the pollinia here. And so this is where the corpusculum or clamp is where the insect leg gets trapped and pulls this whole structure out of the milkweed. And as it dries out, after it pulls out, these translator arms change their angle and they change the alignment of those pollinia. So it changes, it rotates just enough so that when it flies to the next flower, those pollinia can slip right into the stigmatic disc. Pretty incredible that it works, I guess. So here you can see a bee with this just a load of pollinia on its legs here, which is kind of a heavy load to be traveling with, right? So sometimes, however, the bees get trapped, the pollinators get trapped. So here is a headless carcass of a trapped honeybee that just could not get its leg out of that milkweed. So it's just, to me, it's so interesting. It's so close to a perfect pollination process. But if you start killing your pollinators, you might run into some trouble. So a friend of mine heard this story, and now she goes through her milkweed every day in her backyard and makes sure that there's no trapped honeybees. And she, I think she keeps count of how many honeybees or other insects that she has freed from the clamps and the stigmatic discs or stigmatic slits of milkweed. Not necessarily a requirement if you plant milkweed, but interesting to know anyway. So so if it all works, it's fantastic. If you know the pollinia gets attached, the translator arms rotate, it gets back into a stigmatic disc, it gets fertilized, and yes, it produces seed. These are the pods, and these are when the seeds are ready. I think we've all probably have seen the milkweed seed get carried away by the wind, which is of course very beneficial for the milkweed, so it can travel very far away to inhabit some new habitat. So I'm just going to quickly go through the milkweed species, and again, depending on which taxonomist you talk to, we have either 16 or 17 species of milkweed in Utah, which is pretty darn diverse. Idaho, I think, has 7. So we have quite the diverse habitats here in Utah. This is, of course, showy milkweed, the most common one. And yes, a whole bunch of monarchs can be found. Monarch eggs and larvae and caterpillars can be found on the showy milkweed. And you can see here, it's found all over Utah. This is on our Utah Pollinator Pursuit website. So if you want to look again at all of these species, you can certainly do it there. This is swamp milkweed, generally found in northern Utah. Some feel that some monarchs really prefer swamp milkweed over showy milkweed if they're next to one another. It does flower quite well into the fall too, so it provides some nectar later in the season. World milkweed, again, sort of south I honestly can't tell you whether anyone has found eggs on subverticillata or not, and these are still questions that we are trying to find out which milkweeds do monarchs use and to what degree. We have seen monarch eggs on antelope horns milkweed, again found all over the state in pretty dry areas. And we're working with a couple of growers to see if we can be able to offer a lot more of these native milkweeds for people who want to do restoration in open areas or at their homes, etc. This one is it's such a beautiful plant found in very, very dry, deserty areas. Somebody did find an egg on it in Nevada. I don't know whether that egg made it or not. I would be really surprised because it's really dry areas and very close to the ground, and it would be very hot that close to the ground too. Latifolia, Asclepias latifolia down south, very broad leaves. Again, don't really know whether the monarchs use it or not. It certainly looks like it can provide a lot of food to the caterpillars. Tuberosa, this one is kind of interesting, pretty available in the nursery trade. Up here in the north, monarchs don't seem to use it that much, but certainly down in Tucson and in Arizona, they do use it quite a bit. This has some hairs on it, some very fine hairs on it, so which might make it a little difficult for monarchs to use. This one, again, very beautiful plant, but also a little bit hairy, so I would be somewhat surprised if monarchs use it. But again, I am not saying at all that they won't use it. I am just making guesses here, and certainly if you find it, look for eggs, because we honestly don't know. Again, in very dry areas. Labriformis. This is the one I think that one of our community scientists found a whole bunch of it, as you can see, in the Uinta Basin, and he will be going back on a regular basis to see how much the monarchs might use it. Monarchs are they have been sighted out in the Uinta Basin this year already, so hopefully we will be able to tell whether or not they use this large patch of labriformis that he found. Rusbii, again, sort of very dry, that I honestly don't know whether, and not very common either, I don't know whether monarchs use it or not. Again, pretty dry areas, I don't honestly know whether they use involucrata or not. And then just some rare species, particularly rare species of particular note is this Asclepias welshii, which is Welsh's milkweed that's found in the coral sand dunes. People have noted eggs on Asclepias welshii. I don't honestly know. I think the Utah Lepidoptera Society might have the answer to this one, whether they have seen caterpillars and or chrysalises on welshii, on or near welshii. So just quickly, other plants that do have milky sap, the main one that often gets mistaken for milkweed is called, well, it's called dogbane, or Indian hemp is another common name for it. So the easiest way to tell the difference between the two is this dogbane has red stems, whereas the milkweed really has sort of whitish or cream colored stems. And then, of course, if you do get into the flower morphology and take a very close look at it, you will notice that it does not have the hoods and horns of the milkweed. These are others that will produce milky sap, but I don't think that we have ever had people mistake dandelion for milkweed, or some of these euphorbias for milkweed. And that is it for me. I am going to, I guess, mute myself. And I will let Mary take over, and I'll let her tell me when to
Thank you so much, Mindy. You've given us a lot to think about. Once again, folks, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box. So now Mary, who is our ecologist and conservation biologist at Wild Utah Project, is going to talk a little bit about how you can get involved and about Utah Pollinator Pursuit. So she received her PhD from Utah State in biology and community ecology, and her doctoral research explored the relative impacts of changes in vegetation architecture and prey availability on arthropod communities in a sage steppe ecosystem. She has worked as an ecologist and wildlife biologist for a local consulting firm and joined our team in early 2014. And one of the many things she does is develops and supports conservation-focused community science projects, including Utah Pollinator Pursuit. Thank you so much for sharing, Mary.
Thank you. The other panelists, it's just been great to hear about some of the magic behind the scenes of pollination and pollinators in Utah. And I know we're over time, so I'm just going to keep this really brief. Hopefully some of you tuning in have already volunteered as community scientists on the Utah Pollinators Pursuit project. Maybe some of you already helped out with the Monarchs in Utah project last summer as well. So just a reminder, Wild Utah Project is involved in this partnership because we really want to support those stewards of wildlife and habitat in the state of Utah, namely Division of Wildlife Resources, who are working to find solutions in response to these major declines. And this year we're really focused on the monarch butterfly and its western habitats in Utah, as well as the western bumblebee. And you've heard these numbers before, but we roughly have a 99% decrease in our western monarch populations and a 41% decrease in the western bumblebee population specifically. And if we can go to that next slide, you'll see when Mindy brings it up, there you go. We have some maps here that show preliminary data gathered by community scientists over the last couple years that give us a better understanding of where important habitats may be in Utah for both the monarch butterfly and the western bumblebee. So if you are not already participating in this project, we would love to have your support. It's fairly easy to participate, but the sorts of data that our volunteers help gather really allow managers to have a better understanding of the distribution of crucial habitats across the state. And without that information, it's really difficult to prioritize where to put resources to restore habitats or protect them in some way. If you don't have a really good handle on where those crucial areas are and what their current condition is. So if you look at that next slide, there's some resources there for you. I just have to give a shout out to Amanda Barth, who's the Rare Insect and Conservation Coordinator for the state of Utah, and Mindy Wheeler, who you heard from today, the Rare Plant Conservation Coordinator for the state. We've been partnering with these two women who have just done a phenomenal job helping develop this novel community science project with Wild Utah. And if you're interested in participating, you can either just search Utah Pollinator Pursuit and go to that page. And there is a Get Involved section, or you can click on the link there, Monarch Conservation in Utah. Again, there's a Get Involved tab, and that will show you how to participate in this project through just downloading an application on your phone and making observations, helping us get a better understanding of where crucial habitats are. So we really appreciate those of you who are already participating. You are the lifeblood of projects like these. And if you haven't already participated, it's not too late. So check out those resources, please. And thank you so much for tuning in, and to our panelists for sharing all that exciting natural resource, natural history information on pollination.
Thank you so much, Mary. We just have a few questions. We realize we're over time, so if any of you need to leave, this will be recorded and posted on our website this week. So yeah, but I will go ahead and read some of those questions. So first, from Laura Snow, how can the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve help create better habitat for pollinators in Confluence Park?
I guess I'll start with that one, and Amy can chime in. I think what Amy mentioned is to provide as many blooms as you can throughout as much of the season as possible. So down in Confluence Park, anything from early March to October would be fantastic. And Laura, I think if you want to talk to me, we can talk about potential plant lists, etc. It could be, so depending on your time frame, it could be great to start the process now in terms of looking at that plant list and talking with a contract grower to see if we could, if you could get some of those plants grown so you could plant them out when you're ready to do the restoration in the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve. In Confluence Park. Some of those milkweeds that I mentioned, I know that there are some people trying the tuberosa and latifolia that would work pretty well down in your area. And if there's a little bit of moisture, I would think that we could get speciosa going down there too. But again, I think, like Amy mentioned, as many different types of blooms and timing of blooms as possible. So I'm going to mute myself and see if Amy has anything to add.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so yes to the blooms from March to November. Also, the southwestern United States is a global hotspot for solitary bees. Deserts are beautiful for bees. So you're already likely to have a large diversity of solitary bees that are nesting and living in that area. The floral resources are very important. I suspect the landscape is already conducive because you will naturally have a fair amount of bare soil that these ground nesting bees will be able to dig their little cavities into and lay their nests. So if you have something like visitor centers or infrastructure that you want to make sure have bee habitat, the floral resources, the bare ground, but also you can put in kind of rock walls that allow for little cavities for cavity nesting bees to nest in as well. I suspect if you start looking, with the identification tidbits that I gave you today, you'll start seeing bees on flowers, little holes in the ground where they're nesting, and you might already have a high diversity. But being as supportive and aware as possible is excellent.
Thank you so much. Okay, and we have another question for Amy. So this one is, are there bees that can create their own cavities instead of using the cavities of other insects, I assume?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I mentioned that 3/4 of all bees in the world are ground nesting bees, and they are drilling down their own little cavities into the soil. You'll find them from riparian areas, tropical areas, all the way to, again, our deserts throughout the world. They are all drilling their own ground nesting cavities. Only about 1/4 of bees are going to use pre-existing cavities, like our orchard bees and things like that. So yes, I know some question is often about the carpenter bees. They actually will excavate their own nests in wood. They are much, much less destructive and less abundant than other wood-boring insects like termites. So you generally don't have to worry about carpenter bees too much. They will drill little holes in there.
Thank you. And then we have another question. I think this one is also for Amy. Can you tell us anything about the natural history of the Western bumblebee and its decline in the Western US?
Oh, definitely. Yes, the Western bumblebee is of particular concern, and I'm so glad that it's a focal point of the Utah Pollinator Pursuit. As Mary mentioned, 41% decline in its population numbers. We started noticing the decline in this species and a handful of other fairly closely related species after European reared bumblebees were brought back to the US for greenhouse tomato pollination, and they were carrying this little fungal parasite called nosema, and that unfortunately got distributed into our wild populations of Western bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, and a couple of other, again, closely related species. They haven't evolved any resistant to this fungal disease and have exhibited precipitous decline since then. The Western bumblebee used to be so common. It was a little bumblebee with yellow stripes on the upper part of its abdomen and then a nice big white stripe on the lower part. And you would see them everywhere up until about the mid-1990s. Now you'd be hard pressed to find any. They're difficult. So unfortunately, we may think actually that a bumblebee in the Western US called the Franklin's bumblebee may have already gone extinct because of this nosema fungal disease. So we want to get as much information about who's seeing Western bumblebees, understand where those populations are, the habitats they're using, and then try to expand that. So that's one of the difficulties of our industrial agricultural industry, right? That we are moving plants and associated parasites and invasive species from continent to continent without really understanding what the unintended consequences can be. So get on that Utah Pollinator Pursuit. If you see a Western bumblebee, we want to know about it for sure.
Yeah.
And then I think someone asked, I'll just throw this out because I happen to know the answer to this, how long a hummingbird lives. On average, 3 to 5 years.
Perfect. Thank you. And then we have one more question from Mike Popejoy. So for the Pollinator Pursuit project, is there a way to get feedback on the accuracy of our IDs or on individuals we were not able to ID?
Yeah, so this is something we're kind of thinking about now. We really appreciate, first of all, Mike, it sounds like you're participating in the project, and so thank you so much. And if you want to email any of us, our contact information is on the slide right now. But in particular, Amanda Barth is our rare plant expert on the team. But any of us would help kind of answer that question. So those of you who have seen the app, there's a section where you make your best guess at which bumblebee you're looking at after you've shared an image. If you wanted to go ahead and just send that image in an email to one of us, but probably particularly Amanda, we could try to get back to you on that. But it's totally okay to just mark unknown. Amy shared those diagrams that show the different color segments and orders to help you try to key out which bumblebee you're looking at. But again, if there's an error in the ID or you just select unknown, that's okay, because we're going to have those be reviewed by the experts. So either way is fine. And if you yourself just want to hone in on that ID, go ahead and email probably Amanda first, but any of the three of us be happy to help you.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention that Amanda also is the one who took that beautiful photo of the monarch at the beginning of this presentation. Yeah, she's wonderful. Don't hesitate to reach out to her. And then one more question. I don't know who this would be for, but someone told me that monarchs turn into goo in the chrysalis before becoming a butterfly. Is that true?
They do indeed turn into goo.
Wow.
It's not like they just change a few things. They completely dissolve and reform, which is spectacularly amazing.
Organized goo.
It's goo, insect goo.
Very organized goo.
There was a podcast, I think it was This American Life, that talked about the memory of butterflies and that they actually persist from caterpillar through the goo metamorphosis into butterflies. So whatever neural cells are there, they are transforming with caterpillar to butterfly. It's spectacular.
That's really cool. Anything you want to add, Mindy?
No, not necessarily, but that is, I mean, it's again, to me, it's just amazing how it works, you know, in terms of if you're turning into a pile of goo and then you emerge as this beautiful orange butterfly with, you know, spots. It's just, it's amazing.
That really is. Well, I think we have gone through all of our questions. Thanks again to all of our presenters for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. This has been wonderful. And for everyone who joined us as well out there, thank you for being here. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. And then once again, this video is recorded and will be posted on the Wild Utah Project website. So yeah, look out for that in the next few days. But thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week ahead of you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Fun to be part of it.